Hallo zusammen. Pascal hier von Neutrality Studies.
Hello everyone, Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and today I have a very special guest with me, namely the always brilliant retired General Harald Kujat. Mr. Kujat was the highest-ranking officer in the Bundeswehr in the early 2000s and chairman of the NATO Military Committee, which is the highest military body of NATO. General Kujat, welcome.
Herzlich willkommen.
With pleasure.
Herr Kujat, ich möchte gerne mit Ihnen anfangen mit etwas.
I'd like to start with you on something that's currently happening in Europe, and then maybe we'll work our way back a bit, or look at the bigger picture. But these drones that came from Russia, or Russian drones in the EU, and now the fighter jets over Estonia, and the debate that's flared up around it, where you also read and hear people recommending that they should be shot down immediately to show strength. Could you perhaps help us put these incidents into context?
We are currently seeing that the emotional situation surrounding the war in Ukraine is intensifying. This is partly due to the fact that after the, also in my view, very optimistic changes that came with Trump's presidency, we are now in a kind of stalemate and don't really know where is this actually heading. Will there be peace negotiations or not, and what will the outcome look like? Or will this war continue, possibly for a much longer time? In addition, the military situation for Ukraine is very difficult and has actually become increasingly difficult as the war has progressed. And since the Europeans have essentially been indirectly involved in this war from the very beginning, this situation is of course also very stressful politically for the Europeans. Since the beginning of the war, there hasn't been a single attempt from Europe to resolve this conflict through peaceful means. This is now coming back to haunt us, as we find ourselves in a security policy dead end. To put it briefly, this is of course intensifying the debate currently taking place in Germany and more broadly across Europe. If we look at the events you mentioned, there are really two aspects to consider. With the aircraft, the discussion is now emerging about whether they should simply be shot down in order to send a warning to Russia that things cannot continue like this. With the drones, it wasn't the case that people said it was a provocation, or that NATO was being tested, or that perhaps they wanted to gain insights into how NATO would react. One must say the following about this. Russia does not need to use drones to determine what NATO's air defense capabilities are. There are entirely different technical means for that. So the question remains, is this a provocation? And then you have to ask, what would be the purpose of such a provocation? What would be the goal of this provocation? That could only mean that it would lead to an escalation on Russia's part. And at the moment, Russia is truly not in a position, either politically or militarily, to carry out an escalation. Russia is so heavily involved in the war in Ukraine that its geopolitical influence is fundamentally no longer what it once was. We can see this in connection with the South Caucasus as well. Its influence over Azerbaijan and Armenia has noticeably diminished. In addition, its close ally Iran, for example, is in a very critical situation, and it cannot be ruled out that hostilities between Israel and Iran might flare up again. This means that Russia's geopolitical ability to act has been significantly limited by the war in Ukraine. From this, one can only conclude that Russia, in any case, cannot be interested in further restricting its ability to act or expanding the conflict through escalation. That is my perspective at any rate. So the question is, what really happened? And when we look at this drone incursion, we have to keep in mind that we are not being presented with the full picture here. What I mean is, the deputy Belarusian defense minister issued a statement very quickly, saying that the drones had entered Belarusian airspace, that some drones had been shot down, and that Poland had been informed that these drones were now heading toward Polish airspace, which was what made it possible for Poland to react in the first place.
Dass Polen reagieren konnte. Und dann ist die Frage, welche Drohnen.
And then the question is, what kind of drones are we actually talking about here? It was obviously the case that of the 19 drones that entered Poland, some reports say 3, others say 4, were shot down. The rest fell somewhere after reaching the end of their maximum range. Some of them still have gliding capabilities when there is no more propulsion. But they fell down, and the drones were either destroyed or in some cases remained intact. But what this clearly shows is that none of these drones were aimed at a specific target in Poland, nor did they reach such a target.
In Polen gerichtet war und dieses Ziel auch erreicht hat. Hinzu kommt, dass die Wahrheit stellt sich
In addition, and the truth always comes out a bit later, it turns out that the damage to a house in Poland was not caused by a Russian drone, but by an air-to-air missile from a Polish F-16 fighter jet. So I would say that, first of all, we should take a step back in such a situation, try to clarify the facts, and then help to calm things down. That is the first duty in crisis management. After all, Russia has also offered consultations with Poland in this context. That means there was definitely an opportunity to talk bilaterally and clarify things. That should have been the first step. By the way, Russia also said from the very beginning that it was not a targeted attack. But let's move on to the second topic.
Aber kommen wir zum zweiten Thema. Das ist diese MiG-31-Geschichte.
This is about the MiG-31 incident. The issue is that there are increasing calls to shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter NATO airspace. I'd like to add some context to the situation. In this case, the Russian planes were flying parallel to the 12-mile zone, but 2 miles inside that 12-mile zone, within Russian, Ukrainian, and Estonian airspace. It's clearly visible on the map that they always flew parallel to it, not toward Estonia. And the Estonian government has not claimed that there was any obvious intent to attack. This means that the normal rules for air policing apply here. That means, as they are internationally established, that is apparently what happened. The NATO pilots carried this out, and the Russian pilots responded accordingly. A shoot-down would only be justified if a concrete intent to attack could be proven or was evident. That means, in such a case, Article 51 of the UN Charter on Self-Defense would apply. In this case, however, the prohibition of the use of force under Article 2 of the UN Charter applies. That means a shoot-down would be a violation of international law. And if you look more closely at the legal situation, at the International Criminal Code, or if I look at the German situation at the Basic Law and the Criminal Code, then even the order to shoot down would be a criminal offense.
Zu einem Abschuss strafbar. Also ist in diesem Fall auch
So in this case, it would also be necessary to try to clarify and resolve this matter through communication with the other side. Anything else would be escalatory, and that cannot be in our interest, because the consequences are completely unforeseeable. I want to add one more thing. In 2004, I myself, as chairman of the NATO Military Committee, was the one who implemented air policing in the airspace of the 3 Baltic states. The reason was indeed that Russia at the time was frequently violating, especially Lithuanian airspace during transit to the Kaliningrad exclave.
In die Exklave Kaliningrad. Und da die baltischen Staaten nicht über eine
And since the Baltic states do not have effective air defense or air forces, they turned to NATO and asked us to take on that responsibility. Since 2004, this air policing has been carried out in rotation by NATO member states. It was important back then, it is important today, and it has proven its worth. But the crucial point is, this air policing must help stabilize the situation in such cases and not serve as a lever for escalation. Unfortunately, that is what is happening today. That is the opposite of what we originally intended at the time.
Das ist das Gegenteil, was wir damals eigentlich ursprünglich beabsichtigt haben.
Wie ist denn
How should we assess these overflights? I mean, if you look at this map, A, the planes are flying parallel to this line. B, it really does look like they're flying right along the line. So, is it technically difficult to fly like that? Because the Baltics aren't that big. So were the Russian pilots probably aware that they were on the wrong side of the airspace at that moment?
Das kann ich nicht sagen.
I can't say that. Well, first of all, we have to note, if you recall what I just explained, that we are initially observing a change. The Russians are now flying, and should also be flying, in an international air corridor over the Gulf of Finland. Apparently they are no longer flying over land, so they are no longer deliberately and intentionally violating the airspace of the Baltic states. That's one thing. The other is, the territorial waters extend about 12 miles from the land border out to sea. The average width of the Gulf of Finland is about 100 kilometers. That means we have to subtract the 2 times 12 miles, which leaves us with a corridor of about 56 miles in which one can fly. Of course, deviations from this are always possible.
Eine Abweichung davon ist natürlich immer möglich. Wir sehen das auch auf dem Bild. Das war eine gerade Linie gezogen.
We can also see this in the image. A straight line was drawn, but the course of the 12-mile zone is not completely clear. In addition, it appears that the situation regarding the location of the maritime boundary is not entirely settled. This is because Russia and Estonia concluded an agreement on maritime boundaries in 2014, but it has not yet been fully ratified. That means there are obviously also misunderstandings between the two states. Furthermore, it seems that Estonia has extended this 12-mile zone to include the island in question, the one that, according to Russia, the Russian pilots flew past at a distance of 3 kilometers to the north. So for these very reasons, it would have been appropriate for both sides to get in touch and clarify the situation in order to prevent such incidents from happening in the future.
The opposite is happening. There is a media exploitation of this incident, no matter what the incident actually was, together with others. There are now analysts, especially on YouTube, who are connecting this to other developments, namely the fact that the US, this was also recently reported in a Reuters article, apparently wants to scale back certain military aid to the Baltic states and Finland, that is, to the border states with Russia. And Finland has now signed an agreement with the US to open military bases for 15 years. However, the US is not actually operating. Apart from one base, there are currently no others that are actually staffed with personnel. Is there possibly a connection here that the Europeans are saying, we now have to get the US to reverse this policy?
Die USA dazu bringen, diese Politik umzukehren.
Die baltischen Staaten sind natürlich besorgt.
The Baltic states are naturally concerned. I am familiar with the report you just mentioned. It is therefore clear that an intervention by the 3 Baltic states is being prepared in the United States to prevent this program from being terminated. It is not a massive amount, but for these 3 states it is of course very important, also financially. I refuse to draw a connection between the United States' plan to suspend these funds and the attempt to hype up this event, to escalate it, and to portray it as particularly dramatic for the security situation. That's not for me to say, but this connection is made in the report you mentioned. It's true that the United States is generally in the process of scaling back its involvement in Europe, quite clearly. This concerns, for one, the support for Ukraine in this war, both financially and materially. We can see that the United States is shifting the financial and material burden onto the Europeans, and for itself is taking on the role of the peacemaker, trying to bring about a peaceful solution. In other words, assuming a somewhat neutral role. But that also means, and I think this is something we need to keep reminding Europeans, that Europeans are thereby taking on more responsibility for Ukraine's fate. This also means, in the event that Ukraine were to suffer a military defeat, it would also be a defeat for the Europeans. I think that's obvious. The second point is that the Americans are generally trying to reduce their financial commitments worldwide, including in relation to their allies, and to focus more strategically on protecting their own country. This is mainly about migration and similar issues. At the moment, a new strategic concept is being prepared in the United States, and we will see, this will probably be published at the end of the month, that new priorities will be set here, especially in comparison to the previous, the Biden administration. Europeans will have to adapt to this. That does not mean that the Americans will abandon or fail to fulfill their obligations under the NATO treaty, namely to contribute to collective defense. I actually don't see that happening, but Europeans will have to take on greater responsibility, and I don't think that's entirely wrong. I think we need to significantly strengthen the European pillar within NATO, within the alliance. I would even go further, and I have been saying this for years. Europe must strengthen its ability and willingness to assert itself, politically, economically, technologically, but also militarily. Let me repeat, this does not mean that we are decoupling from the United States, or that the United States is decoupling from us. It simply means that burden sharing within the alliance is shifting somewhat, and that we are increasing our contribution, also in our own security interest.
You have also publicly criticized several times that Europe has approached its relationship with Russia and the Ukraine war in the wrong way, and that the necessary pacification, the de-escalation, has not taken place. In fact, quite the opposite. Efforts were made to ensure that Ukraine gave up its neutrality and would never regain it, so that no cooperative security structure could be established on the European continent. Where do you think this comes from? Because when you were in office, in the early 2000s, Ukraine was neutral. There was a NATO-Russia Council, and at least there were still hopes. At that time, Mr. Putin even spoke in the German Bundestag and received standing ovations. So it was a very hopeful time, with the idea that we could still build a common house, as Gorbachev would have said. Why did that not happen? And why are we still not at the point today, where Europe returns to talking with its adversaries?
Yes, that is a very, very important question you have asked, because precisely the things we discussed earlier, which could be the cause of further escalation, prove what mistakes we made in the past. In the 1990s, the relationship between NATO and Russia was very good. We had close political coordination, we even had very close military cooperation. And I just want to mention two examples, because these things are often easily forgotten. During NATO's Kosovo mission, Russia placed Russian troops under a NATO commander. I personally negotiated this with Russia at the time, and the cooperation was excellent. On the other hand, we also helped Russia. I remember the sinking of the Kursk. We conducted follow-up exercises there with deep-sea rescue equipment, and we did many of these things together. A very important aspect of this was to strengthen mutual understanding. There are significant differences in military terminology between NATO and Russia, and this can certainly lead to misunderstandings, and it still often does today. Back then, we worked very intensively to clarify these issues, to promote better understanding, and also to ensure that what we were doing was better understood by the Russians. We also asked the Russians to explain to us how we should interpret what they were doing. And if there were problems, we had regular meetings of the NATO-Russia Council. I was the chairman of the NATO-Russia Council of the Chiefs of Defense, and at least twice a year, the Chiefs of Defense of NATO and Russia would sit together at the table in Brussels to discuss important military matters. The Russians had a military representative at the NATO Military Committee, and he took part in the meetings we held regularly, at least once a month, usually more often. If there were problems, you could just pick up the phone. I did that quite often and called the Russian Chief of Defense and said, "What's going on? What's happening there? Explain it to me."
Was passiert da? Erklär mir das. Das ist vorbei. Sehen Sie, das wäre heute, wenn das
That's over.
heute noch gäbe, ja?
You see, if that still existed today, yes, then developments like the ones we're seeing now, this escalation, this intensification, wouldn't even arise. How did this come about? From the very beginning, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, Russia sought closer ties with NATO. And NATO was also ready for this very early on, already in 1990. And then, of course, with the London Declaration in 1991, and also with the strategic concept of 1991, we initiated what we called at the time a strategic partnership with Russia. The high point was the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997. And now comes the crucial point.
Und jetzt kommt der entscheidende Punkt. Russland hat damals verlangt, dass wir
At the time, Russia demanded that when there are security issues, whether they are concerns of Russia, our own, or shared concerns, we should be able to make joint decisions in the NATO-Russia Council to resolve any emerging escalation, crisis, or conflict as early as possible. Russia assumed that such conflicts could arise particularly in the zone between NATO and Russia, meaning where the former Warsaw Pact states are located. And as we can see, this is now the case with Ukraine. Of course, the situation was that as NATO, we are not allowed to invite a non-NATO member state to make decisions together with NATO.
einladen dürfen, Entscheidungen mit der NATO zu treffen. Das geht natürlich nicht. Aber wir haben im NATO-Grundlagenvertrag...
Of course, that's not possible. But in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, you can look it up, we found a wording that still allows us to reach joint decisions in such situations. It's a bit convoluted, a bit diplomatically phrased, but the result is clear. Well, and the real problem is that these regulations back then, this crisis management mechanism, were created at a time when there was very open and trusting cooperation between NATO and Russia. But when relations became difficult, namely in 2008, this procedure and this mechanism were suspended. Today, and this is the point we discussed, that would of course be exactly what we would need to prevent a situation like the airspace violation in Iceland or the incursion of drones into Poland from escalating to a point where it could no longer be politically controlled. That is the crucial point, but let me get to your question, which I haven't fully answered yet. When did this actually tip over? In my view, the strategic tipping point was the termination of the ABM Treaty in 2001, which then led to the unilateral dissolution of the treaty by the United States in 2002. After that, there were further unilateral withdrawals from very important arms control agreements, which were also very important for Europe, namely the INF Treaty, where an entire category of Euro-strategic weapons that threatened us was essentially eliminated.
Waffen, die uns bedroht hat, vernichtet wurde. Ein ganz elementarer Schritt.
A very fundamental step towards greater security in Europe was taken in 2019, and then the Treaty on Open Skies was also unilaterally terminated. This treaty was extremely important for building trust and ensuring transparency among each other. This essentially set a development in motion at the strategic level. Why is the ABM Treaty so important? This is often disputed nowadays. It is important because it was created in 1972 as a supplement to the SALT Agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, as a complement to the Treaty on the Limitation of Offensive Nuclear Strategic Weapons Systems. In a sense, it is the logical complement to that.
Ist sozusagen die logische Ergänzung dazu. Und Russland hat diese Kündigung so interpretiert.
And Russia interpreted this withdrawal as the United States seeking superiority in this area, thereby endangering the nuclear strategic balance, so to speak. The political rupture occurred in 2008. Of course, the development was already heading in this direction when, at the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, then U.S. President Bush tried to push through an invitation for Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance. That attempt failed at the time, but as is customary in such cases, a face-saving formulation was included in the communiqué, and this wording essentially gave both countries a perspective for NATO membership.
Perspektive für eine NATO-Mitgliedschaft. Eigentlich ist dies von der NATO damals.
In fact, this was not only a wrong approach by NATO towards Russia at the time. A red line was crossed, as the then American ambassador to Russia wrote to his government. No, it was also a wrong approach towards Ukraine, because you rightly mentioned, Ukraine is a neutral state, not only neutral but also non-aligned and free of nuclear weapons. This was established in Ukraine's Declaration of Independence, which, I'll put it this way, was confirmed by a referendum and thus also incorporated into Ukraine's constitution.
So Eingang gefunden in die Verfassung der Ukraine. Das heißt, wenn es jetzt auch die Frage.
That means, when it comes to the question, now I'm returning to the present, of what can actually be agreed upon as a result of peace negotiations regarding the status of Ukraine, one can only say what is stated in the Constitution: neutral, non-aligned, free of nuclear weapons. That is the crucial point. Perhaps one more sentence on this. The relationship then continued to deteriorate dramatically after that summit in Bucharest. In the same year, there was the war in Georgia, for which Russia is blamed, with the accusation that Russia attacked Georgia.
Russland angelastet wird, dass Russland Georgien angegriffen hätte. In Wahrheit war es ja so, dass Russland
In reality, what happened was that Georgia, specifically the then Georgian President Saakashvili, believed that with NATO's declaration that Georgia had a NATO perspective, the alliance's commitment to defend Georgia had already been triggered, so to speak. He then tried to reintegrate South Ossetia, which had separated from Georgia. Russia intervened against this and pushed back the Georgian armed forces. In retrospect, and by the way, there is a very thorough investigation by the European Union that has clarified these events. It is still often said that Russia had already attacked Georgia back then.
It was led by Heidi Tagliavini, a Swiss diplomat. There really is no doubt about it anymore, but this narrative is still being kept alive. The problem now, of course, is that unfortunately, Ukraine has also removed the neutrality clause from its constitution and replaced it with the Ukrainian pursuit of NATO membership.
It has not been replaced. In the preamble of the Constitution, reference is made to both the Declaration of Independence and the referendum. That means, so to speak, that each has been integrated into the preamble of the Constitution. In addition, in 2019, Ukraine also included a provision in the Constitution that roughly states that Ukraine pursues integration into the North Atlantic system, or something similar. Of course, this referred to the European Union and NATO. So we have here two positions that actually contradict each other. But the same also applies, by the way, to the cession of territories. That is also an issue that will play a major role in future peace negotiations.
In künftigen Friedensverhandlungen eine große Rolle spielen wird. Einerseits verbietet die Verfassung.
On the one hand, the Constitution prohibits giving up Ukrainian territory, and the Parliament, the government, and even the President are explicitly obligated to prevent that. On the other hand, however, Article 73 of the Ukrainian Constitution states that the cession of Ukrainian territory can only be legitimized through a nationwide referendum. That means we have this contradiction in the Constitution again. And by the way, President Zelensky has already, some time ago, even offered to give up Ukrainian territory in exchange for NATO membership. So it's not entirely clear-cut.
Das ist nicht so ganz eindeutig.
Yes, we should by no means downplay the law, and especially not constitutions. However, what is written and what is politically implemented are two different levels. May I briefly return to something? Because you interestingly said that you assess the tipping point in relations with Russia as being due to the ABM Treaty in 2000-2001. How do you assess the psychological impact of the Yugoslavia intervention in 1999, the bombing of Serbia? In this process, was that decisive or not? So was that already important or not yet?
Well, that was very important. So that was a crucial point. We've seen this again and again. As I mentioned, the fact that Russia was willing to place Russian troops under NATO command in Kosovo. Of course, this is connected to the fact that Russia originally wanted its own sector, namely in the east of Kosovo, where most of the Serbian settlements are located. So that does play a very significant role, but it didn't happen. I did say that I negotiated this with Russia. The outcome was simply, they don't get their own sector. That was very important to us because it would have led to major difficulties, to major tensions. But they are allowed to participate under NATO command, and specifically in the German sector, under the German NATO commander. That's how we circumvented this problem, so to speak. When I say with great interest, that's actually an understatement. These things were observed very closely.
That is certainly correct. In my view, NATO changed in the 1990s. Above all, for the first time, these out-of-area operations were carried out, which, in my opinion, and according to my reading of the NATO Founding Act, are actually a violation of the NATO Founding Act. Have you heard such criticism from the Russian side, and how did NATO deal with it?
That actually happened later. I'll just mention keywords like Libya, Syria, Iraq. Those were the problem areas. There's really no need to debate that. During the time when we worked so closely together, it was actually, the whole thing was more open. The willingness to discuss critical issues with each other was much greater. As far as I remember, there weren't any major tensions. That was also because Russia was now able to directly present its interests, to bring its own security policy into NATO and communicate it. That was a very important point.
But you wanted to say something. There are also these reports that Russia actually wanted NATO membership, and that these developments, this cooperation, Russia's ability to cooperate in the 1990s, are often used to argue, look, Russia was perfectly happy with NATO, had no problem with it at all, so today they're lying. Russia is lying when it says NATO is a threat. Could you perhaps discuss to what extent there has been a huge change in this regard?
Well, of course, that's connected to what we just discussed. When people talk to each other, when they explain their own position and also listen to and understand the other side's position, it's obviously a completely different situation than when there's no dialogue. So when people talk about each other, as is currently the case and has been for several years now, for example, the issue of NATO expansion is often described as the central reason for the emergence of tensions. I can't agree with that. After all, I led the accession negotiations with the first three countries, Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. And my impression from these negotiations was that Russia was not fundamentally opposed to NATO expansion, even though Russia claims that today, and many in the West claim it as well. Rather, my impression was that Russia viewed this issue in a very nuanced way, considering two main aspects. The first aspect was, what has the historical relationship between Russia and this particular country been like? Was it one of trust or not? Were there tensions? That was a very crucial point. I don't want to name specific countries here or go into detail about them.
bestimmte Staaten nicht nennen will, nicht im Einzelnen darauf eingehen. Der zweite Punkt war, dass
The second point was that the strategic change that could occur with the admission of this state is crucial. That is, would the admission of a new member state alter the strategic relationship between NATO and Russia to Russia's disadvantage? And there are very clear differences here, especially with these three states. And of course, when you look at Ukraine now, Ukraine alone, due to its sheer size and its geostrategic location, is a key element in the question of what kind of change would occur in the military balance.
Bei dem militärischen Gleichgewicht, auch sicherheitspolitischen Gleichgewicht. Das waren die entscheidenden Punkte für Russland.
Those were the decisive points for Russia. And personally, I think what Henry Kissinger once said, this was, I believe, in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea by Russia. He said that if Ukraine is to have a positive future, if it is to thrive, I think he even said, then Ukraine must not become a forward post of Russia against the West. But it also must not become a forward post of the West against Russia. It must be a bridge between the West and Russia. And I consider that a key concept in this entire discussion.
In dieser gesamten Diskussion.
Wissen Sie, aus diesem Grund nenne ich diesen Kanal und auch
You know, that's why I call this channel, and also the studies I conduct, neutrality studies. Because somehow this awareness is currently missing, at least in Europe, that security is not only created through deterrence, but that if you have no enemies, you are also safe. Creating this bridge function and this buffer function is one way to achieve that. And then you even become a building block in the structure, in the infrastructure of security. When did we lose this way of thinking? It used to exist. And in my opinion, the Russians still have this mindset, because even now, they are not demanding that Ukraine become their ally, but simply remain neutral. When did we in Europe lose this, and how do we get it back?
Ja, also diese russische Position.
Yes, I actually encountered this Russian position as early as the mid-1990s. Russia is of the opinion, as I briefly mentioned, that in this region we're talking about, huge conflicts could arise in the future and that therefore must be avoided. And these are essentially Russia's two strategic goals: to prevent a direct confrontation between Russia and the United States, and a direct confrontation between Russia and the Europeans or NATO, which would also involve the United States. That is the objective. That's why Russia has advocated for a buffer zone or a cordon sanitaire, and that's also why Russia has demanded that both organizations, Russia and NATO, must be able, together, to extinguish any fire or spark that arises there before it turns into a conflagration.
Ausgetreten wird, bevor zu einem Flächenbrand wird. Das ist der entscheidende Punkt. So, warum ist das umwandelt?
That is the crucial point. Why is that? And when was it lost? I worked with Helmut Schmidt for a very long time. He was my mentor for many years. And Helmut Schmidt was a proponent of the strategy of balance. He said, and I'm not talking about deterrence here, you can add that as a political principle or conclusion, but he spoke about the need for a military balance. That would prevent one side from feeling the urge to attack the other. So, a strategic balance is a necessary prerequisite for peace.
Notwendige Voraussetzung für Frieden. Hat aber hinzugefügt, es ist keine hinreichende.
However, he added that it is not a sufficient condition for peace. This military balance must be complemented and stabilized politically by talking to the other side, by understanding what their interests are, by being able to assess their capabilities through these personal contacts, and by implementing confidence-building military measures that prevent tensions, by engaging in arms control across the entire spectrum in order to reduce this military balance to the lowest possible level. That is now the essence of what Helmut Schmidt advocated.
Dessen, was Helmut Schmidt vertreten hat. Und hat das ja auch praktiziert.
And he actually put this into practice. If you look at the NATO double-track decision, that's exactly what he always said. The NATO double-track decision came about because the United States and Russia were negotiating over nuclear strategic systems, but completely ignored the security of the Europeans. And into this vacuum, the Russians pushed with their SS-20 armament developing a Euro-strategic threat potential, and Helmut Schmidt said that was unacceptable. The security of the alliance partners is indivisible. That means either these systems are included in arms control negotiations, or there are separate negotiations about them. In order to create an incentive for these negotiations to actually take place, it was ultimately decided to proceed with the deployment. And we all know the result. These weapon systems, this entire category, were then eliminated. This shows that Helmut Schmidt enforced this approach with the United States. But at the same time, he also strongly represented German interests to Russia. I would like to remind you, at the end of November 1981, Brezhnev came to Bonn, and Helmut Schmidt, in the height of the NATO double-track decision, very forcefully represented German and European interests to Brezhnev. But this is the prerequisite for even understanding and being able to assess what the other side wants and can do, what they intend. And only then does it become possible to develop your own options for how to deal with a situation.
Die Situation im Moment ist ja jetzt extrem verfahren.
The situation at the moment is extremely deadlocked, and we are still at the point where I actually criticize the Europeans' unwillingness to bring about a stabilization of the situation. On the other hand, just yesterday, or the day before, we heard from the Kremlin that Vladimir Putin is offering to voluntarily continue to comply with the New START treaty for another year unilaterally, even if it is not extended. In my view, this is a brilliant idea to offer the Americans. Join in. Do you think this is a confidence-building measure that might actually work? Absolutely.
100%. Wissen Sie, das ist ja der einzige Vertrag, der jetzt noch übrig ist.
This is actually the only treaty that is still left. The treaty would have expired on February 5th, 2021. According to the text of the treaty, it could be extended for 5 years. During these 5 years, however, negotiations would have had to continue, essentially requiring a new round of talks. That means, under normal circumstances, the treaty would now expire on February 5th, 2026. That would be a foolish development, one can only say, because it would destabilize the relationship between the two superpowers, both of which possess nuclear second strike capability. It would trigger a new arms race, extremely expensive, extremely risky.
Extrem teuer, extrem risikobehaftet. Deshalb ist das ein sehr vernünftiger Vorschlag.
That's why this is a very reasonable proposal. Now, from an American perspective, especially since Trump already tried in 2020 to bring China on board as well, China has also developed into a nuclear strategic major power. I wouldn't call it a superpower, but certainly a major power. And of course, it would make sense to include China. So this proposal from Putin gives all three countries time to address these issues and develop their own positions. I consider this a very, very positive development. Incidentally, Russia acted similarly after the termination of the INF Treaty.
Nach der Kündigung des INF-Vertrages, da hat Russland ein Einsatz.
Russia announced a unilateral moratorium, which has since been lifted by Russia, but it was an attempt to save what could still be saved and not to start a new arms race in this area as well. So I very much welcome this, and I also hope that in the context of negotiating a new START treaty, people will remember the positive effects that resulted from the two treaties of 1972, and so to speak, as a supplement, complementary to the treaty limiting offensive intercontinental strategic systems, also negotiate a treaty on anti-ballistic systems.
Antiballistische Systeme verhandelt. Das wäre eigentlich das, was man sich wünscht. Im Übrigen,
that would actually be what one would hope for. By the way, I think it needs to be mentioned again at this point. From the very beginning, Russia has always linked the issue of security, including security guarantees, with arms control and disarmament. I'm thinking in particular of the Russian draft treaty to NATO and the United States from December 2021, in which this played a very significant role. But as we know, perhaps, actually in my view, probably The war in Ukraine could have been prevented if serious negotiations had taken place back then. Unfortunately, that did not happen.
Ja, leider ist es nicht geschehen und ich frage mich eben nicht nur, wie.
Yes, unfortunately it hasn't happened. And I'm not just asking myself why. I mean, there are possible explanations in the current political circumstances and so on. And people in the US who have a neoconservative dominated idea of how to establish security. The question for me is, when will Europe wake up and say, okay, that didn't work. It just doesn't work. We have to radically change the whole approach. Maybe one last question. The political level in NATO and the military level, those are two different areas, for example, different levels. Do you have the feeling that, on the military side, at some point the pressure will grow, so that more realism has to flow back into the political level in order to somehow reach an agreement with Russia again? Don't tempt me to speculate.
Verleiten Sie mich nicht zu Spekulationen.
Ja, ganz zum Schluss, nur so zum Schluss.
Ja, ja. Also ich kann es Ihnen.
Finally, I can't give you a definitive answer. It's always a matter of personality, but ultimately it's also a question of the policies of the member states. You see, NATO's security policy, the security policy foundation of NATO, is a compromise that consists of the security interests of all member states. It's very important to bring your own position into that. And that also applies to the military sphere. Exactly, to the military sphere. The Military Committee is, so to speak, the highest, as you mentioned, military institution of NATO, and the chairman of the Military Committee is the top military leader of NATO in comparison to the political side.
Im Vergleich zu der politischen Seite. Ich kann die handelnden Personen im Augenblick.
I can't assess the people involved at the moment, but I can tell you, of course it always depends. Every military leader is naturally also influenced by what happens in their own country, by the political developments in their own country. Even though, in this neutral position within NATO, they are not dependent on instructions from their own state, they always carry that with them, so to speak. And that's the problem. We in Europe as a whole need to adopt a different attitude. And of course, the war in Ukraine plays a truly terrible role in this as well.
Wieder dieser Ukraine-Krieg eine ganz fürchterliche Rolle. Der Ukraine-Krieg ist ja die Beendigung des Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine, or rather ending the war in Ukraine, is not a goal in itself, but rather the prerequisite for us to create a European security and peace order in Europe, in which both Russia and Ukraine have their place and which guarantees the security of all European states. And that essentially means, first of all, a change in mentality and then a political change in Europe. However, it must be said, and I don't want to leave this unmentioned at the end, that perspectives on these matters within NATO are very different. We have the Eastern European states, which naturally feel particularly threatened due to their proximity to Russia. And at the core, so to speak, we have France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, which play a very dominant role here.
Hier eine sehr dominierende Rolle einnehmen, aber wir haben eben auch die südeuropäischen Staaten, die ganz andere.
But we also have the Southern European states, which have completely different interests and also very different security needs. We can see that very clearly now. And the challenge within NATO is to create cohesion and solidarity among all member states, to find common ground. That is currently not the case. In the past, that was always the priority, the main goal, because NATO essentially rests on two pillars. One pillar is the political pillar, which is the solidarity among members. That means every member state is a sovereign state, its interests must be taken into account, but together all interests must, so to speak, represent NATO policy.
Die NATO-Politik vertreten. Und das andere ist der militärische Teil eben.
And the other aspect is the military part, namely the effectiveness achieved through the joint command structure and joint force planning of NATO. At the moment, I see that many things are drifting apart, and this has been the case for several years now. So we need to restore this cohesion within the alliance, and we especially need it in our relationship with the United States. Only if we jointly try to take the interests of the United States into account and align them with our own interests, will we be able to keep the Americans on board for the long term. And that is absolutely crucial for security in the future.
Wort halten auf Dauer. Und das ist ganz entscheidend für die Sicherheit in der Zukunft.
Ich hoffe, dass das zu einer gemeinsamen
I hope that this will lead to a joint approach to de-escalation. But whether that will happen or not, only time will tell. General Harald Kujat, for people who would like to read something from you, is there a place where you occasionally publish something? That's a good question. I ask all my guests, where can people best find you?
Naja, also ich publiziere in der Schweiz.
I publish in Switzerland. In Germany, we have a somewhat different situation, but there isn't, let's say, a platform where I regularly get to speak or write. Rather, it happens more by chance, like this conversation with you now.
Sondern es ergibt sich so wie das Gespräch jetzt mit Ihnen mehr durch Zufall.
Gut, dann für die Zuschauer bitte.
All right, then for the viewers, please just Google General Kujat. He is always a welcome guest on my show as well, should he wish to return. Mr. Kujat, thank you very much for your time today. All the best.
Alles Gute.